wrong for not sharing my savings with my mother? My name is Emily. I'm 24 years old, and if there's one thing people know about me, it's that I'm good with money. Since I turned 18, I've worked tirelessly to save every penny I could, first for emergencies, and eventually for a bigger goal, buying my own house. Growing up, I saw how hard my parents worked, especially my mom, and I learned early on the value of financial security. It wasn't always easy. I passed up vacations, skipped dining out, and stuck to a strict budget. But it was worth it. My savings grew, and with it, so did my sense of independence. My mom, who's 48, has always been a bit of a worrier when it comes to finances. I can't blame her. Raising 3 kids on a tight budget is no small feat. My dad, though quieter on the subject, often leaned on her to manage the household's financial matters. It wasn't uncommon for her to juggle bills, stretch meals, and make ends meet through sheer determination. Growing up, I admired her resourcefulness. But as I've gotten older, I've started to notice how her perspective on money often conflicts with mine. Recently, our family has been under extra financial strain. My younger brother, who's 15, has had some unexpected medical expenses, and the family car broke down last month, requiring costly repairs. Naturally, I've tried to help where I can. I've chipped in for groceries, paid my share of household bills, and even covered some of my brother's school supplies. Still, that hasn't been enough for my mom. A few weeks ago, she made a surprising request. She wanted access to my personal savings account. Her reasoning? It would be easier to handle family emergencies. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a financial issue. It was personal. Saving money wasn't something I stumbled into. It became a way of life for me. From the moment I got my first part-time job at 18, I made a conscious decision to prioritize my future over immediate gratification. At first, my savings were modest, just enough to cover small emergencies like a flat tire or an unexpected bill. But as I got better at managing my income, those numbers started to grow. I opened a dedicated savings account, researched budgeting techniques, and set concrete goals for myself. I didn't come from a family where financial literacy was a big focus. My parents worked hard to provide for us, but there were always more expenses than income. Watching them struggle planted a seed in me. I didn't want to live paycheck to paycheck. So I became meticulous. Every paycheck I earned had a purpose. I divided my money into categories: a portion for current expenses, a portion for emergencies, and a portion for long-term goals. Over time, my discipline paid off. By the time I was 22, I had enough in my emergency fund to feel secure. With that foundation, I started dreaming bigger. I set my sights on owning my own home. It wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about freedom, stability, and breaking a cycle I'd seen my family trapped in for years. Of course, it wasn't easy. I passed up opportunities that most people my age would jump at. Friends invited me on trips I couldn't afford. Nights out were replaced with quiet evenings at home, and I rarely splurged on luxuries. People called me frugal, sometimes even uptight, but I knew what I was working toward. My mom was aware of all of this. She saw the late nights, the sacrifices, and the dedication. That's why her request hit me so hard. Giving her access to my savings felt like more than just a financial decision. It felt like handing over control of the years of hard work I had poured into building a future for myself. Growing up, our family dynamic revolved around a clear structure. My mom was the glue that held everything together, managing the household and taking care of us with an almost superhuman level of energy. She was resourceful and knew how to make a dollar stretch. But that didn't mean we didn't struggle. My dad, while hardworking, often took a back seat when it came to financial decisions, leaving most of the burden on my mom's shoulders. As the middle child, I often felt like I had to navigate between two extremes. My older sister, Sarah, is more laid back and tends to avoid getting involved in serious discussions. She's always been supportive in her own way, but rarely challenges the status quo. My younger brother, Jake, is still a teenager, oblivious to most of the financial stress that comes with running a household. My mom, on the other hand, has always been vocal about her concerns, especially when it comes to money. She's not shy about expressing what she thinks everyone should contribute. Despite the challenges, I've always loved my family deeply. That love is what made it natural for me to step up and help when I started earning my own money. I didn't hesitate to pitch in for groceries or cover unexpected costs, even if it meant dipping into my carefully planned budget. It felt good to help, to lighten my mom's load, even if just a little. Still, there was an unspoken tension in our dynamic. My mom seemed to view my financial stability as an extension of her own. While she would never outright demand money, her expectations were clear. My savings were a safety net she felt she had helped me build, and she saw it as a resource for the entire family. This underlying assumption created a quiet but growing pressure. As much as I loved helping, I couldn't shake the feeling that my independence and hard work weren't being fully respected. This tension set the stage for the conflict that was about to unfold. It started subtly, almost innocently. My mom began dropping hints during casual conversations. She'd mention how tight things were financially, or how the family could really use a bit of extra help. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had always stepped in when needed, and I assumed she was just venting. Then, one evening, she brought it up directly. "Emily," she said, her tone calm but serious, "I've been thinking, with everything going on lately, it would make things so much easier if I had access to your savings account." I was stunned. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Why would you need access to my account?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She explained that with the recent car repairs and Jake's medical expenses, the family's finances were stretched thin. If another emergency came up, having immediate access to my account would, in her words, save time and stress. I didn't know how to respond. On one hand, I understood her logic. Emergencies don't wait, and the family was clearly struggling. But on the other hand, this was my savings account, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. The idea of handing over control felt deeply unsettling. I tried to explain that I was happy to help if something came up, but I wanted to be the one to decide how and when to contribute. Her expression shifted. "It's not that I don't trust you," she said, "but sometimes things happen quickly, and we don't have time to discuss it." I could feel the tension rising between us. What she saw as a practical solution felt to me like an invasion of boundaries. That night, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The more I thought about her request, the more I couldn't ignore the financial struggles my family had been facing. It wasn't like my mom was pulling this out of nowhere. There had been a series of unexpected expenses lately, and they had taken a toll. First, there was the car. Our old family sedan had been breaking down regularly, but last month it gave out entirely. The repair costs were steep, and while my dad tried to find a cheaper mechanic, there wasn't much they could do to cut down the bill. Without a functioning car, it would have been impossible for my parents to get to work or for Jake to make it to his after-school activities. Then there was Jake's health. He's been dealing with some chronic medical issues that require regular checkups and medication. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses add up quickly. I've seen my mom stress over balancing those costs with the rest of the household bills. She's never been the type to complain openly, but it was obvious she was feeling overwhelmed. On top of that, there were the everyday costs that seemed to keep climbing: groceries, utilities, and the little extras that come with having a teenager in the house. I had already helped with some of those, like buying Jake's school supplies and covering a larger portion of the grocery bill when things got tight. Still, it wasn't enough to make a dent in the bigger problems. I couldn't ignore the fact that my family was struggling. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that handing over access to my savings wasn't the solution. While I sympathized deeply with their situation, I also felt a growing unease. Was it fair for me to sacrifice the stability I had worked so hard to build? The thought of my savings dwindling away without my say felt like a betrayal of everything I had worked toward. These emergencies were real, and I understood why my mom was reaching out for help. But I couldn't decide if her request was a fair solution, or a step too far. As much as I understood the strain my family was under, I couldn't help but think about all the ways I had already been contributing. From the moment I started earning my own money, I made it a point to help out whenever I could. It wasn't just about being generous, it was about supporting the people I cared about. When Jake needed new school supplies last year, I didn't hesitate. I bought him a backpack, notebooks, and everything else he needed to start the school year off right. When the grocery bill got too high for my parents to handle comfortably, I stepped in and paid for the week's shopping. Even household bills, electricity, water, and internet were things I helped cover when money was tight. These weren't rare, one-off gestures either. They were consistent, quiet contributions that I made because I wanted to help ease my family's burden. I never sought recognition for it, and honestly, I didn't mind doing it. It felt good to know I was making a difference, even in small ways. But now, as my mom pressed me for access to my savings, I started to feel like those efforts weren't being acknowledged. I wasn't looking for a medal or even a thank you, but the idea that I hadn't done enough left me conflicted. How much more could I give without compromising my own goals? I wanted to help. I always had. But there was a limit to what I could do without losing sight of why I had worked so hard to save in the first place. My contributions were never meant to replace my own security or independence. And yet, my mom's request made me feel as though my boundaries were being tested in a way I hadn't anticipated. A few days after our initial conversation, my mom brought it up again. This time, she seemed more direct, as though the matter had been settled in her mind. "Emily, I really need you to understand how important this is," she began, her tone firmer than before. "What you've been doing is helpful, but it's not enough. Emergencies don't wait, and we can't afford delays when something urgent comes up." I tried to stay calm, but my stomach was in knots. "Mom, I hear you, but I don't think giving you access to my savings account is the right solution. I'm happy to help when I can, but I've worked so hard for that money. It's meant for my future." Her expression tightened. "And what about this family's future? Don't you think we deserve some security too? You're acting like we're going to drain your account dry. I would only use it if absolutely necessary." I could feel the frustration building in her voice, but I stood my ground. "It's not about trust," I said, though the words felt inadequate even as I spoke them. "It's about boundaries. I need to be the one to decide how my money is used." Her face dropped, and I saw the hurt in her eyes. "So you don't trust me? You don't think I'd do what's best for this family? After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Those words stung. My mom wasn't yelling or being unreasonable, but the emotional weight of her statement hit me like a brick. I didn't know how to respond. How could I explain that this wasn't about repayment, that my savings represented more than money? It was my independence, my security, my hard work. The conversation ended abruptly, with neither of us feeling satisfied. I couldn't shake the sense that my refusal had widened a rift between us, one that I wasn't sure how to repair. And yet, I knew I couldn't give in. Not like this. After that second conversation, I knew I had to make my stance clearer, even if it risked deepening the tension between us. I waited for a quiet moment when my mom and I could talk without interruptions. I needed her to understand that this wasn't just about money. It was about maintaining control over something deeply personal. "Mom," I started, my voice steady but soft. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I want to be clear. I'm not comfortable giving you access to my savings account. It's not because I don't trust you. It's because this account is something I've worked so hard for. It represents years of effort, sacrifice, and planning for my future." She listened quietly at first, her expression unreadable, but I could sense the tension rising. "I understand that emergencies happen," I continued, "and I want to be here for the family, but I can't do that by handing over control of my money. I need to be able to manage it on my own terms." Her response was swift and cutting. "You talk about your future like it exists in a bubble. Do you think your family isn't part of that future? Emergencies don't wait for permission, Emily. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us." I tried to keep my tone calm, though her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. "I know that, Mom. That's why I've always helped when I could. But giving up access to my account doesn't feel right to me. I'm willing to help in other ways, but this is a boundary I need to keep." The room felt heavy with unspoken words. My mom didn't argue further, but the look in her eyes told me she thought I was being selfish. For me, though, this was about protecting more than my money. It was about standing up for what I believed was fair. The silence after our conversation lingered for days. My mom wasn't one to explode in anger or shout, but her disappointment was palpable. It was in the way she avoided looking directly at me during meals, how her responses to my questions became clipped and short. I could tell she was hurt, and that knowledge weighed on me more than I wanted to admit. One evening, she finally broke the silence. "Emily," she said, sitting down across from me in the living room, "I just don't understand why this is such a big deal for you. We're family. Families are supposed to stick together and help each other. When did you start thinking of yourself as separate from us?" Her words felt like a punch to the gut. Separate? That wasn't how I saw it at all. I struggled to find the right response. "Mom, it's not about being separate. It's about making sure I can help in a way that doesn't jeopardize everything I've worked for." She shook her head, her frustration clear. "I'm not asking for all your money, Emily. I'm asking for a safety net for this family. A family you're part of. You act like I'm going to misuse it, like I don't know what's important." I could feel my chest tightening. "It's not that, Mom. I need to have control over this. It's not about you. It's about me being able to manage what I've saved." Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she stood up and said, "I just don't know where I went wrong." Her words were soft, but laced with disappointment, and they echoed in my mind long after she left the room. That night, I lay awake, questioning everything. Was I being selfish? Was I failing as a daughter? Her reaction made me feel like I was drawing a line where there shouldn't be one, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to erase it. The next day, my older sister Sarah decided to share her opinion. She hadn't said much up to this point, staying on the sidelines while my mom and I hashed things out. But now, she seemed ready to jump into the fray. "Emily," she started, leaning against the kitchen counter, "I get where you're coming from, but honestly, I think you're overreacting." Her tone was casual, but her words immediately put me on edge. "Mom's not trying to take your money. She's just asking for a way to make things easier for everyone." I sighed, already feeling defensive. "Sarah, it's not about the money. It's about boundaries. I've already helped so much, and I'm happy to keep helping. But giving someone access to my savings? That's a step I'm not comfortable with." She rolled her eyes, a gesture that made my frustration bubble up. "You're making it sound like Mom's some kind of villain. She's just trying to make sure we're covered if something big happens. What's the point of saving all that money if you're not going to help your family when they need it?" Her words stung more than I expected. "I do help," I said firmly. "I've been helping since I started working. This isn't about not wanting to help. It's about making sure I can still have a future while doing it." Sarah shrugged, clearly unconvinced. "Look, I'm just saying, if I were in your shoes, I'd let her have access. It's not like she'd abuse it." That casual dismissal of my concerns hurt more than I wanted to admit. I felt like she wasn't even trying to understand my perspective, and it left me feeling more isolated than ever. If my own sister couldn't see my side, who would? While my mom and sister had been vocal about their opinions, my dad remained noticeably silent. He wasn't usually one to get involved in family disputes, preferring to let my mom take the lead when it came to these kinds of issues. But this time, his silence felt heavier, as if it carried its own judgment. At dinner one evening, as the tension between my mom and me lingered in the air, I decided to ask him directly, "Dad, what do you think about all this? About Mom wanting access to my savings account?" He looked up from his plate, clearly caught off guard by the question. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I think your mother just wants to make sure the family is taken care of," he said finally, his tone neutral. "She's always been the one managing emergencies, and I think she sees this as another way to do that." I waited for more, for him to say something about my side of things, to acknowledge the work I had put into saving, but nothing came. His answer felt like a safe, middle ground response, one that avoided taking a clear position. It stung more than I expected. "But don't you think it's important for me to have control over my own money?" I pressed. He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I'm staying out of this one, Emily. It's between you and your mom." And just like that, the conversation ended. I wanted to feel relieved that he wasn't siding against me, but instead, I felt abandoned. His refusal to engage left me feeling like I was fighting this battle alone. Without his support, the weight of the conflict seemed to rest squarely on my shoulders, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could carry it. After days of tension, the doubt started creeping in. Was I really being selfish? My mom's words echoed in my mind. Families are supposed to stick together. My sister's casual dismissal of my concerns felt like another reminder that maybe I was the problem. Even my dad's neutrality began to feel like quiet agreement that I was in the wrong. I started replaying every conversation, analyzing my tone, my arguments, and their reactions. Was I being too rigid, too protective of something that, in the grand scheme of things, could help my family more than it could help me? The idea of my savings disappearing into unexpected expenses scared me, but so did the thought of being the one who let my family down. The guilt was suffocating. I thought about how hard my mom had worked to raise us, her endless sacrifices to make sure we had everything we needed. How could I turn around and tell her no when she needed my help? If the roles were reversed, would I feel betrayed if my child refused me the same support? And yet, a small but persistent voice in my head reminded me why I was standing firm. This wasn't about refusing to help. It was about setting a boundary. I'd already contributed so much, always stepping in when things got tight. But giving up control of my savings felt like crossing a line that I might not be able to redraw later. It wasn't just about money. It was about independence, about making sure I had something left for myself after years of giving. I wrestled with these conflicting thoughts late into the night, staring at the ceiling and running through every possible scenario. No matter which way I turned, I felt trapped between wanting to be a good daughter and needing to protect the life I'd worked so hard to build. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I could trust my own judgment. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe they were right. But maybe, just maybe, I wasn't wrong for wanting to hold on to something that was mine. When the guilt became too heavy to bear, I tried to shift my focus to the future, the one I had been working toward for years. Every hour I spent at my part-time jobs during college, every weekend I skipped a night out with friends to save money, every budget I stuck to, all of it was for a life I envisioned for myself. A life where I wouldn't be constantly worrying about making ends meet or relying on someone else for financial stability. That vision wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. Freedom to choose where I lived, to invest in a home of my own, to create a safety net for any challenges life might throw my way. It was about breaking the cycle I had seen growing up, the cycle of constant financial anxiety, of always just scraping by. My savings weren't just numbers in a bank account. They were my way of ensuring that I wouldn't have to relive those struggles. But as I thought about that future, I couldn't ignore the pull of the present. How could I focus on my dreams when my family needed me now? The thought of my mom worrying about whether she'd have enough to pay for Jake's next doctor's appointment or how they'd handle another car repair made me feel selfish. My future felt important, but so did their present. The balance between those two priorities was what haunted me. If I gave in now, Would I be sacrificing the independence I'd worked so hard for? And if I didn't, would I be turning my back on the people who had always been there for me? The future I had spent years building toward felt closer than ever, but so did the risk of losing it if I made the wrong choice. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to separate my own feelings from my mom's perspective. I knew she wasn't asking for access to my savings out of greed or malice. She was scared. She saw the mounting expenses, the unpredictable emergencies, and the weight of managing a household with limited resources. And she saw my savings as a lifeline, a safety net that could protect the family from sinking any further. That realization didn't make her request any easier to accept, but it did make me see where she was coming from. I could picture her lying awake at night, calculating bills in her head, worrying about what she'd do if something went wrong. She had spent her entire life putting us first, sacrificing her own needs for the good of the family. In her eyes, asking me for help wasn't unreasonable. It was natural. After all, she had given everything she could for me. Why wouldn't I do the same for her? And that's where the guilt came in. It wasn't just the guilt of saying no. It was the guilt of knowing I could help and still choosing to hold back. Every time I saw my mom stressed, I felt a pang of responsibility. Every time Jake needed something I couldn't afford to provide, I questioned whether I was doing enough. And every time Sarah reminded me how much easier I could make things by saying yes, I wondered if I was being too selfish to see the bigger picture. But at the same time, there was a part of me that felt this guilt wasn't entirely fair. Yes, I wanted to help, and yes, I loved my family. But did that mean I had to sacrifice everything I'd worked for? Wasn't there a way to support them without giving up my own future? The line between helping and enabling was blurring, and I wasn't sure where to draw it. I wanted to be there for my family, but I also wanted to be there for myself. And I wasn't sure if those two things could coexist. Feeling overwhelmed and unsure of my own judgment, I decided to confide in a close friend. Laura had always been a voice of reason in my life, someone who could offer a fresh perspective when I couldn't see through my own emotions. Over coffee, I laid out the entire situation, my mom's request, the family's financial struggles, and my fears about losing control of the savings I'd worked so hard to build. Laura listened intently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "Emily, I think the fact that you're even questioning this shows how much you care about your family. But I also think you need to ask yourself what helping looks like to you, and whether it's sustainable." "Sustainable?" I repeated, unsure of what she meant. "Yes," she said firmly. "You've been helping in so many ways already, paying for groceries, covering bills, supporting your brother. But giving your mom access to your savings? That's not just helping. It's handing over control of your financial future. If you do that, what happens when there's an emergency that affects you directly? Who's going to help you?" Her words hit me hard. I hadn't thought about it that way before. I'd been so focused on the immediate needs of my family that I hadn't considered the long-term implications for myself. "I just don't want to seem selfish," I admitted. "They've done so much for me." "Helping isn't selfish," Laura said gently. "But you have to help in a way that protects your boundaries. Otherwise, you're not really helping. You're just delaying bigger problems." Her perspective gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, I started to see that it was okay to care about my family while still caring about myself. After my conversation with Laura, I tried to approach the situation more objectively. I began thinking through the what-ifs that my mom kept bringing up. Her biggest argument was that emergencies happen fast, and having immediate access to my savings would save time and stress. So, I decided to imagine what those emergencies might look like, and whether her request truly made sense. The car breaking down again? I could handle that. If I gave her the money directly, she could pay for repairs without needing full access to my account. Medical expenses for Jake? I had already pitched in for those before and would gladly do so again. Even something bigger, like a sudden bill for the house, didn't seem like a scenario where I wouldn't step up to help. I couldn't think of a situation where handing over control of my savings would make more sense than simply helping when needed. The more I thought about it, the more hypothetical these emergencies seemed. My mom wasn't asking for money to solve a specific problem. She was asking for unrestricted access just in case. That phrase began to feel like a slippery slope. What counted as an emergency? A missed payment on a utility bill? Groceries running low? Or something even less urgent like covering a last-minute trip or buying new clothes for Jake? The ambiguity made me uneasy. If I agreed, how could I ensure the money was being used the way it was intended? And what would happen when the savings ran out? Would I be expected to replenish the account indefinitely? These questions swirled in my mind, reinforcing my resolve. Emergencies were real, but they didn't justify giving up the control and boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. I wanted to be there for my family, but not at the expense of losing everything I had built for myself. One evening, after another tense dinner where we barely spoke, my mom pulled me aside. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice. "Emily, I don't want to fight with you about this," she began, her tone almost conciliatory. "But I need you to understand how serious this is. If you can't trust me with this, I don't know how we're going to move forward as a family." Her words sent a chill through me. This wasn't a direct ultimatum, but it felt like one. She wasn't just asking for access to my savings anymore. She was tying it to our relationship. The implication was clear. My refusal wasn't just about money. It was a failure to trust her, to support her, to be the kind of daughter she expected me to be. "Mom, I do trust you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But this isn't about trust. It's about what I'm comfortable with. I've always helped when I can, and I'll keep doing that. But giving you access to my account isn't the solution." She sighed deeply, shaking her head. "You keep saying that, but what happens when there's a real emergency? What happens if something happens to your dad or Jake and I can't get to the money in time? Are you going to feel good about sticking to your boundaries then?" I felt my heart tighten. She wasn't yelling, but her words carried a weight that was almost harder to face. She was appealing to my worst fear, that my decision might one day cause harm to the people I loved. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone," I said quietly. But as she walked away, I wasn't sure if she believed me, or if I even believed myself anymore. After my mom's words sank in, I spent the next few days wrestling with an uncomfortable reality. This conflict wasn't going to resolve itself. No matter how much I tried to explain my position, my mom seemed set on her belief that I was being selfish and untrusting. The emotional weight of her disappointment and the subtle pressure from my sister made me feel like I was fighting a losing battle. But as much as I hated the tension, I also knew I couldn't give in. Handing over control of my savings would solve a short-term issue, but might create even bigger problems down the line. For me and for my family. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about standing firm in a decision I believed was right, even if it made me the villain in their eyes. I started to accept that my mom might never fully understand my perspective. To her, this wasn't about independence or boundaries. It was about trust and family loyalty. And in her mind, my refusal wasn't just a no to her request. It was a rejection of the values she had always tried to instill in us: unity, sacrifice, and putting family first. That realization hurt, but it also helped me let go of some of the guilt. I couldn't control how my mom felt or how she interpreted my decisions. All I could do was stay true to what I believed was fair and hope that, in time, she would see that I wasn't trying to be selfish. I was trying to protect what I had worked so hard to build. This wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was the reality I had to face. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of peace in knowing where I stood. With everything weighing on me, the guilt, the tension, and the endless second-guessing, I knew I had to make a definitive choice. I couldn't keep straddling the line between wanting to help and needing to protect my boundaries. So, I made a decision. I wouldn't give my mom access to my savings account. It wasn't an easy choice. I sat with it for days, replaying every conversation in my head and imagining every possible outcome. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that giving in now would only set a precedent. If I handed over access to my savings, it wouldn't stop there. The emergencies wouldn't stop, and neither would the expectations. My savings account, which had always represented security and freedom, would no longer feel like it belonged to me. When I finally told my mom, her face was a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I guess this is what you really want," she said, her voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "I just hope you don't regret it later." I tried to explain, one last time, that this wasn't about not trusting her or not wanting to help. "Mom, I love you, and I love this family, but I need to protect what I've worked for. I'll always be here to help when I can, but I need to do it on my own terms." She nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. I could tell she didn't agree, and maybe she never would. But I also knew that this decision was the right one for me. It was about more than money. It was about setting a boundary and standing by it, even when it was uncomfortable. Walking away from that conversation, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had made my choice, and there was no going back. I just hoped that, with time, my mom would see that my refusal wasn't about turning my back on the family. It was about ensuring that I could stand on my own while still being there for them when it truly mattered. Now that everything has unfolded, I find myself replaying it all in my head, over and over again. I think about my mom's request, her disappointment, and the tension that settled into our household like an unwelcome guest. I think about my sister's casual dismissal of my concerns, my dad's silence, and the way I've been second-guessing myself at every turn. There's no part of me that wanted to hurt my mom or make her feel unsupported. In fact, that's the last thing I wanted. But this situation wasn't as simple as just saying yes to her request. It was a question of boundaries, of how much of myself I was willing to give before I started losing sight of who I was and what I'd worked so hard for. I keep coming back to the sacrifices I've made to build this safety net. Every skipped night out, every side job, every carefully planned budget, it was all for a future I could control. And yet, the guilt still lingers. My mom saw my savings as a resource for the family, while I saw it as my lifeline to independence. Neither of us is wrong, but we're standing on opposite sides of a line that feels impossible to cross. I wonder if I could have handled it better. Should I have been more open to compromise? Should I have offered more reassurance? Or was I right to stand my ground, knowing that giving in might have set a precedent I couldn't undo? These questions haunt me, and I don't know if I'll ever find answers that feel truly satisfying. And so I turn to you. After hearing my story, what do you think? Was I wrong to protect my savings, even if it meant disappointing my mom? Should I have prioritized her needs and the family's financial struggles over my own independence and future plans? Am I selfish for drawing this line, or was I justified in standing firm? I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer here. All I know is that I tried to make the best decision I could, with the values and priorities I've held close my entire life. So, am I wrong?